Hello, colleagues, and welcome to the last in our series of sold out online events. When we started this series back in January, we were really in the depths of winter, and I had to have the big light on just so that you could see me. But here we are now in broad daylight, and apologies if you're seeing me in just a bit too clearly on this Tuesday night. So my name is Lorraine Devlin, and I'm a classroom teacher in Glasgow, and I'm part of the STEP committee. Before I hand you over to Jamie, I'm just going to take a brief moment to talk to you about our organisation. So Scottish Teachers for Enhancing Practice evolved from the Association of Chartered Teachers in 2014. We are an independent grassroots teaching organisation comprising classroom teachers who organise career-long professional learning for other teachers. The committee is made up of teachers at different stages of their career and from a variety of sectors and from all over Scotland. We are very grateful to our speaker tonight, who I'm just about to introduce. Before I do so, I want to thank you for attending this session. STEP events are usually in person, and feedback from our delegates tells us that this is highly valued, but circumstances have forced us online, and we are delighted with the response to tonight's event and to all of the events in this series. So please continue to support the work of STEP through social media. And tonight we would appreciate it if you would tweet using the hashtag StepPL21. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce Jamie Thom. Jamie is a classroom teacher, the author of several books, most recently Teacher Resilience, Managing Stress and Anxiety to Thrive in the Classroom. He is the host of a really informative and engaging podcast called The Well Teacher, and I'm a big podcast fan, so I'm going to absolutely recommend it. It's well worth a listen. On top of this, Jamie's written articles and hosted an English teaching podcast for TESS. Now, this list isn't exhaustive, and I've certainly not meant it to be the first rough draft of a CV for you there, Jamie, but it'll give you an idea of Jamie's professional commitment. And perhaps later on, when we have a chance for questions, we can talk about the kind of things you're up to now. So what comes across in both Jamie's writing and very clearly in the podcast is his authenticity. So I think, Jamie, that you say sometimes quite challenging things in a very matter-of-fact way. And it's not to court controversy, but to improve our relationship with work, our own experience and the experience of our learners. And finally, I'll mention that Jamie has a young family, including a new baby. So many congratulations, and doubly thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to speak to us tonight. So Jamie, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to your very silent but very attentive audience.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. That was very kind of you. And also just like to say a hello to everybody, and thank you so much for joining this evening. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all. And I also know this is a really, really busy time of the year. So thank you for giving up some of your time, and I hope it will be useful for you. And before I start properly, I want to just make it really clear that this picture is in fact me. And like, I'm a full-time English teacher, and I also wanted to recognize that this year, over the past 12 months, has been incredibly challenging and demanding for us as a profession, and incredibly frustrating. And one of the things I guess I've learned in kind of thinking about kind of resilience and managing stress and anxiety is sometimes we need to pause and recognize all the strengths we've shown on an individual level, and recognize what a wonderful job we've done in the past 12 months, given the circumstances. So I guess I'm giving us all a collective, massive, huge, well done for everything we've done in the past 12 months. I think it's been incredible. Okay, so over the next kind of maybe 35, 40 minutes, what I want to do is talk about, I guess, two specific things. First of all, to reflect on why resilience is such an important quality for us as teachers. And I want to break that down into three key areas. And they're areas that I think are absolutely vital to help ensure that we have longevity in our profession. because that is ultimately what I think we need as a professional force. We need teachers staying in this fantastic, wonderful career and working the magic in the classroom over a sustained period of time, but doing so in a way that is manageable for us. And that'll be a key word over the next 40 minutes. So those three things are about teacher mindset, about teacher actions, and our behaviour inside the classroom. Another thing I want to reinforce is the fact that every single person who's here this evening is utterly unique. And what causes some people stress and anxiety will not cause other people stress and anxiety. And I guess it's really, really important to recognize that we all respond differently and we all have different ways of, I guess, making teaching manageable. So what I'm not going to say is I'm some kind of Gandhi figure who's gliding through my school day in a really calm and measured way. I'm not. One of the reasons I write about this or I think about this is because I do, I guess, struggle with anxiety and trying to keep myself as kind of calm as possible. So if you don't mind, if I start by just taking you back about 9 years, and I was 26, and I'd just been promoted to the role of assistant head teacher in an academy school in central London. So here I was, it's the big man. I've got all this responsibility in this really kind of, I guess, really important school in central London. And I thought I was absolutely flying. I thought I was invincible. I thought I was like education's, this school, I thought I'm going to fly here. Now, there was a couple of warning signs. The first was that when I was offered this position, I was told you have to shave your head. And secondly, you have to wear a black suit. And they should have been warning signs, and they should have been signs that this perhaps was a slightly odd place. And then when the head teacher told me in the interview, he said, I expect blood. Again, I should have run a country mile. And part of the contract was you had to work 6 days a week. You had to attend a Monday night meeting that ran from 5 o'clock until 10 o'clock every single Monday. And the expectation, the cultural expectation, was this was an environment that you worked and you pushed and you worked every hour of every day. And I did that role for 2 years. And about 18 months in, I had what I didn't recognize at the time, but I think I do now, was really ultimately a kind of breakdown. And I guess mentally, physically, I was the utter epitome of a burnt out match. Completely depleted. I spent 6 weeks in bed. And it took me a really, really long time to recover from that. Partly because it was a kind of toxic environment, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But partly because I had just ultimately worked myself into the ground, completely burnt out. And I share that story because it's synonymous with lots and lots of people's experience in teaching and in education. That we give, we give every ounce of ourselves and put ourselves at real risk of burnout. So what I decided to do, I guess, as a sort of, as a recovery from that experience, was I did a range of things, really. First of all, I did a educational master's, which looked at retention in teaching. And that involved interviewing about 100 teachers, looking at their experience of teaching and how they thrived in the classroom. And then I set up a blog and was lucky enough to write three books, which have at their core this idea of how can we thrive in the profession. And I'm fascinated, I'm really interested. I did start a doctorate on teacher wellbeing, but then I realized I was getting slightly candle-like again and kind of cut that back. So it's something I've thought a lot about and considered. And what I'd like to do, I guess, as I say, is talk you through and hopefully get the opportunity to respond to some questions on what I've learned from that research, and both on an individual level and in that case of talking to and reflecting with lots and lots of teachers about it. So I guess the first thing we need to think about is, what is a resilient mindset? What do we mean by resilience? Now, there's lots of things that kind of come to mind when we consider that word resilience. I think for me, the three key things are about kind of springing back, about being adaptive, adapting what we're doing, and about persevering and continuing. Now, I think as teachers, they are hugely important qualities, because as wonderful as I think our profession is, it is incredibly demanding on an emotional level. We really do make ourselves quite vulnerable, because we stand up in front of, in primary teaching, a class for the full day, in secondary teaching, kind of chained, not chained, certainly not chained, but groups of 30 students over and over again. And for anyone here who might have struggled with kind of mental health or their own well-being, you'll know that standing up in front of a class becomes inordinately more challenging when we don't feel well, secure, resilient within ourselves. So I guess the encouraging thing for us is that this resilient mindset isn't fixed. We're not born within a kind of ingrained level of resilience. As I said, we're all complex. We all have, excuse me, different parts to our characters and facets, but we can actually develop our resilience. And there's lots of work over this in the past kind of 20 years about neuroplasticity, and about this idea that we can develop areas of our brains. And resilience is one of those areas that we can develop. And as I recognize, I kind of acknowledged at the start, ultimately, we might not feel it yet, but the experience of the past year will have, in many ways, built our resilience as individuals. And we can see how we've honed and developed it. So, in terms of building this mindset, what are some of the things we can do? And everything I'm going to share today isn't about a systematic build-up of resilience. It's about us as individuals, individual teachers in the classroom, regardless of what management want to do in our schools, etc., regardless of what government want to do. This is about empowering us to be the best versions of ourselves. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the inner narrative. And as I say, lots and lots of teachers that I've spoken to really, really feel this aspect of themselves as professionals. It's that voice, that continually negative voice that appears to have a huge megaphone in our heads and criticizes us and tells us we're not good enough in the classroom, and tells us that we don't differentiate enough, and tells us that we should be marking our books more, and tells us that we can't manage behavior anymore, etc., etc., etc. And it's an inbuilt aspect of our brains. It stems from this idea of the negativity bias, that we are, as sentient individuals, often more inclined to reflect on things in a negative way. So why is that so crushing for us as teachers? I think it's particularly kind of, excuse me, pervasive, because we don't get a lot of feedback. From my perspective as an English teacher, I don't often have spontaneous round of applauses in my lessons. The kind of kids I teach, they're not often at the end of lessons sort of waiting behind to say, "Thank you so much for that, sir. That was magnificent." And probably, maybe I'm a rubbish teacher. Maybe I need to be doing more here, but I'm sure that's probably an experience of lots of people in the room. And, we don't often have, lesson observations, things where we get told we're doing really, really well. So, and if anything, for me, adolescents, they're certainly not the most captive of audiences. You have to work hard. So I think challenging the inner narrative that we have as teachers is really, really important. Now, when I first heard the concepts of kind of self-compassion and inner kindness, I'm a Highland bloke, tossing cabers and wrestling cows was how I spent my childhood. So if I told my kilt wielding hairy friends about developing more inner compassion, I know exactly what they would have said to me. But I think it's absolutely vital. And I think one of the things that I've found the most helpful is actually being more self-aware of how I'm talking to myself, being more self-aware of the impact it's having on me. And even asking the question often throughout the day, is this helpful? Is what I'm doing inside my mind making me more effective, more efficient? Is it aiding my well-being as a teacher? And part of it's about reframing situations. If there's a lesson that goes disastrously wrong and that inner narrative is going absolutely wild and it's telling us we should quit teaching and we should get an office job and we're never going to be able to do this. Instead, it's looking at it as a kind of opportunity to learn. And I think that's what really resilient teachers do. They see areas where they can learn and they can move forward. And instead of berating themselves, they take proactive steps to ease that journey moving forward. And even a lot of that is to do with a kind of humor. And it's, I guess ultimately it's not taking ourselves too seriously. It's recognizing that we maybe have this tendency towards a negative inner critique. And it's sometimes just laughing that off and seeing it for what it is. It's that kind of ancient hunter tribe type voice that's warning us about what's going on in our lives. So that's number one, challenging that inner narrative. Now, part of doing that, I think, and moving towards this idea of recognizing and being positive in our professional roles is about the quality of gratitude. Now, when I first I've moved further and further up the country from London to Newcastle, hoped to trying desperately to get back to my native land. And when I was in Newcastle, I was really struggling with kind of moving from that toxic environment into another school because I bought that inner narrative with me. I bought that sense I'm not good enough anymore. And I really wasn't sure if teaching was right for me. So I read a book by Oliver Sacks, which is called Gratitude. And it's basically a collection of essays that he wrote at the end of his life. And he's a really, really famous kind of neuroscientist, Oliver Sacks. He's written amazing books. And he wrote this collection of essays just after he was diagnosed with cancer, terminal cancer in his 80s. And it's all about kind of aspects of life that he was grateful for. And it's a beautiful, beautiful read. And it began that process of reframing how I looked at my kind of own life and experience. So I set up a really, really rubbish blog, which was called Teacher Gratitude, which nobody read, but I really quite enjoyed writing it. And it was basically about finding every week something that I would write about that I felt a sense of gratitude for. And that might be a particular lesson, that might be something I've read, that might be an interaction I'd had with a student, something particularly kind of joyful. And what I found over the course of the weeks I was writing, and I wrote every week for a year, and still nobody read it, but it actually made me change the way I was looking. And instead of looking at all the negatives, I started looking towards more of the positive and feeling that sense of appreciation for what I really, really care about, which still is teaching in the classroom. And I think, that doesn't have to involve starting up an educational blog. That can be just scribbling 3 things down at the close of a day that you feel grateful having experienced. And that can be anything at all that happens in the day. And I think one of the beautiful things about working with young people is or working in a school, no matter how bad a day we've had, and we do have them, there's always moments in there that are profoundly kind of moving and joyful and enjoyable. So making that process of kind of maybe implicit feelings of gratitude as explicit as possible, writing things down, or just taking a couple of minutes to think about things that we are grateful for. So that's number 2, gratitude. And number 3, excuse me, is about this idea of development. There's a fascinating kind of Zen Buddhist philosophy, which is called beginner's mind. And it's all about this idea of kind of moving away from thinking of yourself as someone who's very, very knowledgeable and someone who knows everything there is to know, and instead taking a little bit of a blank sheet to life. I don't worry, I'm not going to talk about Zen Buddhism for very long, but I think it's really, really interesting when we think about it in terms of teaching. Because quite often, if we see ourselves as experts, we heap more pressure on ourselves, and we perceive as us being sort of infallible, as this idea that we are kind of, it feeds that perfectionism, is I guess the phrase that I'm looking for. And one of the things I think that teachers who feel confident and resilient in the craft, they see it as something that they can always be learning and developing and growing and moving forward in. Because the reality is that that's true. Teaching is remarkably complex, incredibly complex, and has all these different layers and all these different focus areas. And that might be something that can terrify us, or that might be something that can really encourage us, enthuse us, motivate us. And again, in terms of how does that practically work, I think it's about picking a kind of pedagogical focus area and spending time on it and really diving into it. It could be something as simple as questioning. I spent a term once just thinking about questioning, writing about questioning, reading everything I could get my hands on about questioning. And I was really thinking about it and running through it in my own lessons and teaching, and getting really excited about how I could develop and push forward this area. So seeing opportunities about how we can grow and develop as classroom teachers, as leaders, as human beings, and moving away from the pressure that comes with seeing ourselves as experts, no matter how long we've been teaching, and instead adopting that kind of beginner's mind. What can I develop and improve in? Okay, so they're the 3 mindset things I wanted to explore. The idea of the inner narrative, this emotion and this idea of gratitude, and then finally this focus on development. So to move off slightly from the kind of philosophical elements of resilience and to focus on practical teacher actions. Okay, what can we do now that's going to help us feel calmer, more effective, and more resilient? So the first of these teacher actions is something really, really simple, okay, and it is sleep. And there's a great irony in this, okay, as Lorraine mentioned at the start, just had a little boy 2 weeks ago, and I've got a toddler who's just turned 3, and I'm getting very, very little of this at the moment. So I'm going to blame any rambling I do, or the whole ramble that this might well be, on a lack of sleep, because it's actually been fascinating to think about sleep in this context. Because the 2 things I think sleep are essential for, and have shown in my kind of own life over the past 2 weeks, are emotional regulation and memory. Now, emotional regulation and memory strike me as being pretty high up in terms of the teacher hierarchy of skills. And I've felt over the past couple of weeks, because my little boy had quite a few problems, and he's sort of, I won't go into too much detail again, but it's impacting now how he's sleeping. So without sleep, my emotional regulation has been nowhere near as effective as it been before. So, for example, how kind of anxious I might have got about this presentation has been elevated. My wife and I's middle of the night arguments have been hugely elevated because we're sleep deprived. My memory is shot. I can't believe I'm remembering elements of this presentation, because you can't quite commute and can't quite remember in the way that you feel capable of doing normally. So if that rambling isn't enough, Matthew Walker, has written the wonderful book, Why We Sleep. The line that I really, really remember from it that resonates whenever I'm thinking about sleep or talking about sleep is this is the line he's written, the shorter you sleep, the shorter your life. So I'll read that again just for dramatic impetus. The shorter your sleep, the shorter your life. So practical teacher actions. And if you can hear, by the way, I apologize if you can hear a screaming child in the background, that is said sleep destroyer. So the things that have worked for me, the first is this idea of a routine, which I don't have at the moment, but if you are in a position where you can make a routine, it's incredibly helpful. So setting an alarm for the same time, no matter whether it's the weekend or during the week, going to bed at the same time, etc. It really helps the consistency of our sleep. The second is about the use of technology. And one of the chapters I've written about in Teacher Resilience is becoming a digital minimalist. So cutting down the amount of time we're using technology for. And certainly if we want to sleep well and effectively, it's about cutting off that technology a good couple of hours before we go to bed. And the third and the final one is about over-caffeinating. It's about, I guess, cutting down on the amount of caffeine that we drink, because what that does is it just destroys our natural sleep cycle. So just to repeat those three key things about building a routine, about cutting down on technology, and about not over-caffeinating, and don't have a 3-year-old and a baby at the same time. Okay, so that's the first teacher action. The second teacher action is about setting boundaries. And again, I think lots of teachers I've spoken to really struggle in this area, because I think it's partly to do with our temperaments that we have as teachers. We like to I don't overgeneralize, but to talk for myself here, I like to kind of please. I like to feel like I'm doing something helpful. I like to support people. So whenever somebody asks me to do something, often, I certainly used to just say yes to everything. I used to agree to everything, and whether that would be, running a book club, etc., running a running club, anything, I would always say yes to it. And then what happens is we heap even more pressure on our time, which is incredibly precious as teachers. It's incredibly precious. We heap even more pressure on ourselves, and we get into this cycle of kind of stress and anxiety because we're adding more and more and more. So in the first book that I wrote, which was called Slow Teaching, I talked a lot about kind of discipline and being disciplined with how we use time as teachers, and marking out and being really explicit about when we will be working and when we won't be working. And those boundaries have to involve cut-off points. And if we don't set those boundaries, the danger is with teaching that we continually work. And it's like a chain. We're working. And I think actually saying no is a really important thing for us to do as teachers. Being clear that we can't take this on at the moment, and obviously being polite about it in the sense of, giving a reason why we can't take on this additional thing, I think is something we need to do much more of, particularly if I think of classroom teachers. We need to have that sense of autonomy where we can cut things off and say, no, we can't do that, it's not acceptable. And I think it's something in Scotland, in England, that there wasn't as many boundaries as there are in Scotland. I think it's a really positive thing about Scottish education that there's more support in place for us to set those boundaries. But certainly from an individual point of view, I think we can say no much more often as teachers and not be made to feel guilty about it. So that's number 2, setting boundaries. Number 3, about what he calls a pandemic of anxiety and stress is created because we have lost connections with each other. It's true of what happens in teaching. I think far too often we are isolated in our own classrooms, and many of us are kind of replicating what each other are doing, rather than, I guess looking outward rather than looking inward and seeing the wonderful, incredible stuff that's happening all around us. And some schools, I think, do this absolutely brilliantly. They drive forward that collaboration, and they drive forward that collaboration on sharing resources, on teaching and learning, on well-being, and there's a real sense of community that exists within those environments. And Andy Hargreaves has written fantastic stuff about collaboration and what it does for a teacher's mental health and well-being. And I think, well, what can we do as an individual teacher? There's lots of things we can do. And for me, someone who's interested in teaching and learning, I think trying to drive forward that element in a school is really important. And asking colleagues, can you pop into a room for 5 minutes? Can you watch a little bit of teaching? Can you see how they're approaching something? Because whenever I watch another teacher, it fires me up. It makes me feel really passionate about what I do. And I never, ever leave someone else's room without a little handful of things I'm taking away into my own practice. Even if it's how they phrase something, how they've asked a particular question, it's tiny little things. And that fires us up. But then there's the sense of kind of drawing together our subject understanding and knowledge. For me, a fantastic English department meeting is about us sitting down and dissecting, well, how are we going to approach the text? And how are we going to make and encourage young people to get really, really excited about this particular text? So drawing together all the amazing qualities and understanding that exist within a school context. And I think in terms of well-being, it's really, really important. I'm currently doing a sort of 6-month coaching qualification to become a qualified educational coach. And I'm finding really, really interesting, but also demanding. I've spent the last couple of weeks looking at listening and thinking about how well we listen to each other in educational context and in a school. I think often because we're so busy and we have so many things to do on our to-do list, we can sort of spend a lot of our time in schools on autopilot and perhaps not be as there in terms of cognitively and listening to colleagues around us and supporting them in the way that we all need supported, no matter how we might appear on a surface level in a school. We all need emotional support. So I think just giving that time to other people, and that in itself has a quite transformative impact on our own well-being, because when you're kind and supportive and generous to other people, it makes you feel better about yourself and how you function in a school. So in terms of those teacher actions, just to recap on those 3, number 1 was about the focus on making sure that we're identifying time for sleep. Number 2 was about being explicit on those boundaries and being clear about how we best function in our schools and in our own work. And number 3 was about driving forward collaboration in our own environments. Okay, so thank you so much, everyone, for your patience. I've got one last area that I want to talk about that I think is a real, that I think is a real kind of spark for causing stress and anxiety for teachers. And that is some of the things that happen in our classroom. And again, I just want to share some practical suggestions for how we can build our resilience in each of these areas. So the first is probably the most obvious. What is the main driver that builds up anxiety, builds up stress for teachers, and can kind of destroy our resilience? And that is behavior. And I think, one of the things I would say about this is with behavior, it's another area where I think we can never really see ourselves as experts. We're always learning and developing our capacity to manage behavior effectively in the classroom. And another thing I think is really important is about transparency with this. When I moved from a fancy leadership job in London to back to a classroom teacher in Newcastle, I got absolutely destroyed in my first year in this new school, completely destroyed by a year 9 class, which is sort of secondary 3. And this picture could be that class. I had no control of them whatsoever. But I just shut the door and I went into battle with them myself, rather than being transparent with the school and saying, I can't cope, I need help, I need support. So my first point about behavior is that idea of transparency, openness. That focus on collaboration is so important with behavior. And then the second is about this idea of a behavior mentality. I think for me, what's been most helpful is seeing behavior in regards to this idea of stoical philosophy. So the kind of basic tenet of stoical philosophy is about managing what we have control over and focusing on what we have control over. So Epictetus, who was kind of one of the founding fathers of Stoical philosophy, and he was born a slave, and he was made lame by his master, and then he was banished from Rome. So he had a pretty terrible time of it. And his famous Stoical philosophy quotation is, "We cannot choose our external circumstances, but we can always choose how we respond to them." So we cannot choose our external circumstances, but we can always choose how we respond to them. I think that's a brilliant quotation for teachers, because we have no choice over the complexity that will exist in the classroom in front of us. And it will be complex. It'll be full of all kinds of individual experiences that will temper and impact how those young people behave for us. And young people like us, they've got all kinds of things going on in the background. And I think, so what can we do? For me, it's a bit about kind of portraying this kind of dispassionate calm, about seeking to not let it, and this is easier to say than it is to do, but not let it emotionally overwhelm us. And instead focusing on the things we can control. So we can control our reactions. We can control our lesson content. We can control how the room is organized. We can control how well we follow the school's policy. We can control how we speak to people around us. And we can also control how we interact with young people, our kind of classroom weather, our positivity, our energy. And a word I've not talked about yet, but I think is vitally important, is our compassion for the experience of the young person in front of us. And then, to take another Epictetus quotation, it is not what happens to you, but how you react that matters. And that's the idea I think is important when managing behavior. It's our reactions, it's our presence for those young people in front of us. So again, just to reiterate, I know that sounds much easier in practice, much easier to say than it is to do in practice. I don't take away from that. But for me, that's a kind of idealistic aim. The character, the actions, the behavior that I try and influence in terms of my own actions in the classroom. So behavior, right. Number 2, I've got a couple more things to do, folks, and I'm really looking forward to hopefully being able to respond to some of your questions. Number 2 is about planning. I'm also really interested in the idea of minimalism. So minimalism is about simplifying our lives in as much as possible, and about kind of decluttering and getting rid of all the kind of extraneous and extra things in our lives. And I'm thinking a lot at the moment about minimalism in terms of teaching, about how we can cut out lots of the additional fluff that make up our life as teachers. Now, minimalistic planning, I'm not sure how this would go in my head of department, but I'm going to pitch it. But minimalistic planning is about trying to be utterly clear about what it is we are trying to achieve with young people and how we're going to get there. So for me as an English teacher, let's imagine, for example, I'm teaching something on writing. If I was thinking minimalistically, if I cut everything else out, what's going to be the most important thing I want to do in that lesson to help encourage them to improve their creative writing? And for me, that would be about modeling. Model, live model. Things that are not going to take a huge amount of time. And minimalistic planning, I think, is cutting out things like a kind of obsession with photocopying stuff and handing things out and thinking, is this a valuable and useful way for me to use my time? Is it moving forward the young people's experience in front of me? And that minimalism can stretch with everything. It can stretch into questioning. It can stretch into, kind of plenaries, everything. How can we do as little as possible, but have as much impact for the young people in front of us? So it's something I'm thinking a little bit about, but obviously I need to do it when I'm not sleep deprived for it to be really, really useful. But think in terms of hopefully things to take away is thinking, simplifying lessons, making things as clear as possible in terms of what we want young people to do and what we want them to achieve. And then hopefully in turn, we'll be more efficient with our time. Okay, the final thing I'm going to say is a massive strain on terms of teachers, in terms of time, in terms of adding to stress and adding to anxiety, is feedback. And I think, certainly my practice has evolved in this. When I first started out with kind of feedback, for me, all it was writing streams and streams of stuff in kids' workbooks and throwing it back at them. And I think, we need to be a little bit more nuanced about how we see feedback. It's vitally, vitally important because we all need feedback, no matter where we are. And in our experience, we're the experts, they're the novices, etc. So they do need elements of feedback. But again, I'm going to harp on about minimalism again here. I apologize, but how can we do as little feedback as possible, but make it really, really helpful and really move forward young people's learning and development? And there's lots of ways and lots of suggestions I think we can do that. And the first is about using kind of verbal whole class feedback. So I often find when I'm circulating around the room in the classroom, I do it in a very kind of sporadic, I almost float like a typical English teacher. I float around the room, kind of gazing wistfully. Whereas I'm now trying to be a bit more incisive in using that time to speak to young people and give them really clear feedback as much as possible, be that positive or things that's going to move that forward. And that dialogue and that discussion is often much more meaningful than writing streams and streams on the books. The second thing is just making sure that any feedback we give, there's some kind of action towards it and it leads to something meaningful. For me, that might be a young person writing a couple of lines again in the workbook, etc. But it has to lead to some kind of action from them. So we're not wasting all that valuable time that we're writing things. And whole class feedback, there's lots of brilliant stuff on Twitter about this at the moment in terms of how to provide really good, helpful whole class feedback. and having lessons that are just based on feedback, not being scared to slow things down a little bit and go over them in more detail. Okay, I'm conscious I've rambled away now for quite some time. So I really, really appreciate listening. And the last thing I would say is, I'm going to be really cheesy, but I'm going to quote from the Nelson Mandela's favorite poem, which was Invictus. And there's 2 lines. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. And I think, hopefully, what I've been talking about kind of encapsulating those 2 lines. As teachers, we need to be autonomous, and we need to invest as much energy in ourselves and our own well-being as we do in the young people in front of us. Teachers are naturally hugely kind and hugely compassionate, but we need to also give some of that kindness and that compassion to ourselves. And in doing so, hopefully, we can thrive in our profession for quite some time. And last slide is just a couple of things. I would really love to, if you don't get a chance to ask your questions tonight, my email's on there. I will try and respond to everything. If you've got a question, it's just jamiethom123@aol.com. I am on Twitter, but I've taken a wee 6-month secondment because I'm fully embracing this minimalistic living. And also, I'm far too busy changing nappies. And they are the 3 books that I've written. And the podcast is called the Well Teacher Podcast. So thank you so much for your time. And I'm looking forward to hearing people's questions. Thank you.
Hello, so I'm back. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed that, and I think it did give people a real flavour for the kind of content of the podcast. And I know this was mentioned in the comments, but I think Sheila said you're very refreshingly honest, and I think that's what you do in the podcast as well. So that's absolutely great. So we've got a number of questions, quite a lot via Menti. So I don't know if we're going to get through them all. So like Jamie said, if your question doesn't come through tonight, and there are some themes that we'll try and group, but if we don't have a chance to answer your question, then please reach out. But just a few really relevant things came through. So someone has asked, do you think it makes a difference if you observe and collaborate with someone in a different school compared to someone in your own school?
That's a great question. I think it's a fantastic opportunity if you get the opportunity to step outside of your school context and see how things are done in another school context. It's a fantastically enriching experience, because I've kind of taught in 4 different schools now, and they've all been incredibly unique, and teaching and learning has been incredibly unique within those circumstances. So I'm hugely one of the reasons I kind of joined Twitter and do all that kind of sort of stuff is because I think we can learn so much from each other as a profession, not just in our own departments, our own schools. I think the more we can reach out and embrace things other schools are doing, even that different countries are doing, it just adds to the excitement and the energy of what you can learn and how you can keep moving forward as a teacher, I think.
Yeah. So a similar experience. I think I've been in 4 different schools now, and I just think it does really add a lot to kind of, I think sometimes this is not obviously like strictly true for everybody, but I think your overall knowledge of like how learning and teaching changes and how leadership changes as well, and how that changes you as well. So here we go. So another one, do you think there's a link between teacher agency and well-being?
Oh, that's another great question. Yes, would be the very short answer to that. Yes, I think I guess this presentation was very much focused on individual kind of ownership for teachers and how teachers can take kind of control of that. But I think there's a huge amount in terms of systematic stuff that happens in schools that profoundly impacts on teacher well-being. And I think it's why events like this are so important. And the more we're kind of talking about individual teacher well-being and individual teacher resilience, the more hopefully we can start to influence practices that happen in school because some kind of working environments and some things at schools, for example, to talk about my own kind of cultish type experience in London, that's the thing that's burning out teachers. So I think absolutely it's a vital conversation for us to be having as a profession.
Yeah, agreed. I know, I think just to offshoot from that, there was an article this week that was published in TES, and I think there'd been some research and they talked, the article was titled "Train Teachers to Constructively Challenge Authority," and it was from the Commission on School Reform, and one of the things they talked about was there's a culture of compliance that's developed in school, but I think we have to be very careful about making a distinction between a profession that's silent and a profession that's silenced. And all too often, perhaps, teachers don't have that autonomy and don't have that agency, and that's a big issue, especially in terms of such an important profession. So back to the actual questions. Here's another great one. So being transparent with a school regarding poor behaviour does not mean you always receive the support that you need. How do we gain the support from above without having them really ignore the request?
Well, yeah, yeah, and I think it's very easy for me to say here. You know, you need to be transparent and you need to be open, because I do recognise that some school cultures will be more supportive and open to that conversation happening than others. And how do you? And I think that's a great question. I'm thinking about my own experience here, and I think it has to come down to being persistent, in the sense of, you know, kind of heads of department, management, etc., being persistent in terms of saying, no, this is a real issue, and the behaviour that I'm faced with here is not acceptable. And then I think ultimately we have, you know, things are in place for us as teachers, particularly in Scotland, which I think are great, in terms of looking at union support and in terms of finding as much support as we can, because there's absolutely no way that teachers should have to suffer in silence with behaviour that we can't accept. So I think it's a really thoughtful and important point, but I would say pushing things and being really transparent and really open and really not accepting, you know, it's about that sort of what I was talking about in terms of saying no. And I think you made a really good point there about us being we shouldn't be a silenced profession. So if you don't have the support from, you know, your line managers, etc., it's looking at who else can give you the support.
Okay, there's a few others, but I'm aware that we're coming up to time, and I want to make sure that we can pull this together. So anything else we'll send on to you. And again, anyone else who's submitted a question, if you haven't had that read out, then please feel free to send it to Jamie. I know there's already been a couple of really positive responses to tonight, and people asking about your books. Thanks so much for putting those up. That's brilliant. So I want to just say thanks again for, it was really relevant. As Sheila had said previously, you're quite a really refreshing voice, I think. I agreed wholeheartedly with your comments about never really seeing yourself as the finished expert, but we're always developing and everything. That's something I think through STEC that we talk a lot about, and even in conversations we've had with people in government, that's what we've talked about. I also think tonight, events like tonight, help us to build resilience, but it's important that it comes from a teacher and who is well aware of the challenges of the job, and someone who's continuing as a classroom practitioner. I think sometimes it's things are lost very quickly when you leave the classroom about the challenges that people face, and how realistic it is to kind of move to persevere with those challenges. So I'm going to say a big wholehearted thanks. We know you're busy, and I did hear the crying in the background. God bless you. But thank you so much for giving up your time tonight. And just I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I know from the comments already that other people have. I'm also going to say thank you very much to all of the attendees tonight for your very thoughtful questions, your participation and your attendance. As I mentioned at the start, this is the last in our current planned series of online events. The committee will meet later in the year to discuss what we're going to do in the future. So we will really welcome your ideas for speakers, and this might be you yourself if you want to share an element of your own classroom practice, because we would love to hear about that, and we know that our delegates would love to hear about that, whether it's something you're doing day to day or any sort of professional inquiry you're undertaking. Your colleagues would love to hear about it. So feel free to get in touch with us via email or through social media. And tonight's session and the others in the series will be available through the Scottish Teachers for Enhancing Practice YouTube channel. And that's it, everyone. Just big thanks for us, and big thanks to the committee for all their hard work as well through this series of events. And thank you so much, Jamie. Good night, everyone.